What's up, everybody? Get the microphone a little closer so we can talk. How is everyone doing? We'll get started momentarily here. So, first day of defense expert testimony today. We had I think it was four witnesses or five from the defense that were presented. And we were, there's a lot of different people going. But I think the most important and the longest testimony that happened was obviously the testimony of Barry Brodd, which was the first defense expert witness who was there to present on use of force. And he did indeed give the top line conclusion that Derek Chauvin's use of force was justified. But the problem was I was very underwhelmed by his cross-examination. I did not think that Mr. Brodd fared very well. Basically, I mean, there were parts of Broad's testimony that held up well. I mean, the general talking about one-upsmanship and when he was, kind of avoiding making any claims about how the force, about the force level being used on Mr. Floyd. But those are the easy parts. The part where I thought he felt that he had a very bad moment was right at the beginning of cross-examination. So Broad made a very aggressive claim on direct that the restraint of Floyd on the ground, the prone restraint, was not a use of force because it was just a control position. But then through cross-examination, the prosecution lawyer was able to establish that not only was there clearly the guy's feeling pain, and then Broad's own definition of what constituted a use of force was the existence of continuing pain. And, as a result, you've got the situation where, basically Broad's explanation of what constituted a use of force didn't make any sense, right? On the one hand, he's saying it's not a use of force because it's just a control position. But on the other hand, he's defining it as anything that you feel pain. And then he's conceding that the guy would have felt pain in some of the positions. What I noticed was that it's like he just didn't really think through. It was a very flippant analysis, and I don't even think it was necessary. I don't think it's necessary to make an argument that that Chauvin wasn't using force when he was restraining Floyd on the ground. I think, I can see an obvious explanation that would be something like there was a continuing use of force as long as Floyd was resisting and kind of writhing around, that Floyd never really complied until he fully passed out. And as a result, that theory would make more sense to me in terms of a defense explanation of what's going on. But in terms of what, the general theory about how actually Mr. Broad was, following, that Mr. Broad put out there that this wasn't a use of force while Chauvin was on the ground, that didn't make any sense. And I think it undermined the credibility of his testimony generally. He came across as sort of very much like a hired gun. Unlike some of the other witnesses where you get the vibe of they're ideological and motivated to testify, here you get the vibe that Broad is just like a hired gun who was going to say what he was going to say no matter what, and that his opinion was sort of hastily constructed. And so I think, that's not good, right? The defense needs a use of force expert to actually get up and persuasively say that what Chauvin did was justified, or at a minimum, certain parts of what Chauvin did were justified. Maybe you say that it wasn't justified to stay on him once he had passed out and that he should have gotten off him at that point. But maybe you say everything up until he passed out was reasonable, because I could see how that would be the case, given the things that Broad was saying. But no, just the sort of blanket, everything he did was reasonable, everything he did was fine, because it wasn't a use of force. That just didn't seem like a very defensible opinion. And I think it fell apart on cross when he sort of admitted that it was in fact a use of force when he just said it wasn't on direct 5 minutes earlier. It's not good. I got on the defense witnesses yesterday for contradicting each other, right? There wasn't a cohesive story from the prosecution expert witnesses on use of force when it came to holding somebody in the prone position. But here you have the defense expert basically contradicting himself in a matter of minutes. That's not good for the defense at all. So I was I was definitely underwhelmed by the defense expert on that front. In general, I also don't think he did a good job of, he was very, very vague and very general in the way he was describing what proper use of force was. He wasn't doing a good job of, using the Minneapolis materials. I think somebody pointed out, this is from Barry. The idea is, when is Chauvin's attorney going to pound home that they were following training methods? And it's like, that's what I was kind of missing in the Brodd testimony, was where's the discussion on direct of Minneapolis policy? Is there some, maybe that's coming later. I think that's going to be necessary in terms of like Chauvin being able to explain that he was trained in this way. Maybe he wasn't, in which case, like, I don't think he can win on the use of force question. I mean, if he wasn't trained in this way, if there was never any justification of this technique, then, I mean, he could be in problem. He'd have serious problems on use of force. So I was a lot more, like, given the inability of the prosecution to have a coherent story, I thought I was, kind of skeptical of the prosecution and thought the defense would be able to lock this one down. But if this is the expert they put up there, I was unimpressed by him. I don't think that, and I'm unimpressed enough by his testimony that I think it would be kind of malpractice to let this guy go up on the stand again. There were places where he wasn't bad and didn't allow the prosecution to control his testimony. But, he just had, from the outset, there were portions of his opinion that were barely defensible and that he basically folded on within 5 minutes of starting cross. So that's not good. That's like that indicates you just didn't think through your opinion very well, and is just generally unimpressive. But the other witnesses, there was some interesting stuff that happened there. We got evidence that dealt with we saw some evidence that related to Floyd's earlier arrest and his earlier appearance of intoxication. I don't think that did that much damage to Floyd, other than to establish that he's used drugs before and had a high blood pressure before, but that was already kind of known and admitted into evidence. I thought one of the videos that actually was somewhat helpful, if anything, to the defense in an interesting way was they put Officer Chang, who was a park police officer who was called in as backup, and he was just observing. His job was to kind of supervise the two passengers in this car, Maurice Hall and Shawanda. I forget her last name, Shawanda Hill, maybe. And he was supervising them in the car that Floyd had been pulled out of. And, his body cam video kind of reveals the reactions of Floyd's friends. And a big part of it is they're just like, why? What is George doing? Why is he resisting arrest? Stop resisting. Just get in the car. And that, that I think in general was one of the better moments for Chauvin and for the defense, because it like, if his own friends are flabbergasted by his behavior, you get the sense that, like, the prosecution's tried to say, oh, he wasn't really resisting. They've tried to downplay that, but, like, his own friends are up there saying, oh, this was clearly resisting. And I thought as well, you had there was a decent moment of testimony from one of the passengers in the car, Shawanda, who talked about how Floyd was asleep and he couldn't, they had to, like, work really hard to rouse him, even though the employees were coming around. That was, I think, effective in terms of, if they're going to set up a sort of fentanyl overdose reasonable doubt question. That's useful testimony, because one of the big things from the medical experts is, well, there was no evidence he was sleepy or asleep, so there's no evidence of a fentanyl overdose. It's like, literally right before this, he was, like, barely rousable from his car. And so, if you're talking about a narrative of the combination of the fentanyl and the adrenaline and ultimately led to, the oxygen deprivation, I mean, that helps create some reasonable doubt. I think that was a pretty important moment of testimony. And I don't think that witness realized that what she was saying was going to be so important to the defense strategy. But in terms of, the use of force expert, I do not think that went well for Chauvin in the defense. I think his analysis was very surface level, very flippant. I thought the cross-examination of him was generally quite well done. I think this is like whoever did that for the prosecution did a really good job on cross. I think they were able to effectively undermine his opinion pretty dramatically. And so going forward, at this point, I think, if you're looking at the probability of an acquittal, it went down after today, right? Like, in the abstract, you sort of estimate that there's going to be a quality expert witness coming out to defend Chauvin's use of force. And if this is the best Chauvin has, then that's not a good sign, because I don't think the jury is ultimately going to weigh this guy's testimony that heavily in comparison, especially when you think about how cumulative all the different police officers getting up and saying that Chauvin's use of force was excessive compared to this guy. I just think that they're going to decide that Chauvin's use of force was in fact excessive. And so the question is that then you have to get, create reasonable doubt, probably more on causation than anything else. Unless they have a better expert coming. So that was, so that's interesting. V-Mojo Man talks about the nodding off thing. The EMS, you call that doing the nod. That's really interesting. I think, and that might be the ultimate weakness of where the medical examiner is actually able to say, no, this actually was a fentanyl overdose. And I'm really curious about the expert that they're able to put on. So that's kind of what I got in terms of analysis. I don't think, we have much of today was, there was some interesting, motions practice at the beginning of the day. I think the question was whether they were going to admit portions of the video of Officer Chang. They had to actually, snip out a part of it, because part of that video included Officer Chang looking at George Floyd's criminal record, which was definitely inadmissible. So, because they thought that would just prejudice the jury, which actually I think that was probably the correct evidentiary ruling. So you didn't get any of that. But no, I think the end conclusion here is that this was, things are less likely to go in the direction of an acquittal today. I still think an acquittal is the most likely outcome here, just because there's, I still feel like there's just enough reasonable doubt, disagreement between the experts. I think ultimately it's going to be easier for Nelson to have a strong closing than it's going to be for the prosecution. But it's just not. It wasn't a good day. Like, the defense expert looked clownish, frankly. I was very unimpressed. Do I agree with Dershowitz that Chauvin has to testify? After this, it might be the case that he needs to testify. I mean, like, you might, because especially if you can't if you didn't objectively prevail on use of force, then you're going to need Chauvin to explain what the hell he was doing. And I think that, after I didn't know that Dershowitz made that claim. I think that I respect his judgment on this. I think this is a very, as I said, I think this is a case where Chauvin probably should get up and testify. It's unlikely that they're going to be able to get him to concede to factual admissions that would hurt him, because all the facts were sort of on display, and, being able to humanize himself and try and explain himself to the jury, I think would help. But I don't know, that's obviously a decision for Nelson, and that would depend on, you would have to prep him seriously and be, really give him some prep, cross-examination prep to make sure that he wasn't going to do harm to his own cause. But I still think that's actually a reasonable thing to go ahead and do. But yeah, no, I think the prosecution the prosecution had one of its better days today. I think, the prosecution case was kind of a rambling mess through much of the 2 weeks that they were on, cumulative witnesses, contradictory witnesses that Nelson was able to extract a lot out of and cross. But they had their first cross today, and their first cross went very well. I do not think today was a good day for the defense. Somebody says, Mallet says, I thought the discussion application where a person dies isn't use of deadly force. Question becomes, is the use of force that resulted in accidental death adequately applied? Yeah, that was a good part of the discussion, where it's like, hey, I mean, was this use of force fair? And again, I think, Brodd and the defense could have done a much better job of explaining, look, like, his particular factors aside, it is justified to hold someone like Floyd, who is resisting and writhing around in the prone position, that maybe you'd want some sort of argument about how the recovery position doesn't give the same kind of control to the officers as the prone position does, which would seem to make sense to me, right? It's hard to stay on top of somebody in the recovery position. You kind of got to hold on to him with your arms, and if he's stronger and writhing and resisting, the recovery position doesn't seem to me that safe, right? If you're thinking about, like, well, we need to keep this guy in one place. So I don't know. I feel like this is where I see just a lot of really flippant spots in Brodd's testimony, where he's just like, no, it was all reasonable. It was all reasonable. And I don't think he really did a good job of going into detail and explaining things. What was with the eye rolling from the prosecution? Well, I mean, some of the eye rolling, I think, was just a Brodd's testimony that in the moments of weakness. I thought in general it was good. So yes, Postovic announced that Nelson is going to move for acquittal. This is less dramatic than people might think. almost every at the end of the prosecution's case in chief, the defense almost always moves for acquittal, as a legal matter, right? Saying that the judge should acquit because there's not sufficient evidence for a jury to find that the defendant committed the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. That's going to be denied. That's going to be heard tomorrow and denied. You make that motion because you need to make it essentially, it's a motion to preserve the issue for appeal, right? Like on appeal, you need to basically, to overturn a trial verdict, you kind of need to win that. Essentially, like, if you want to just like reverse the verdict, you need to preserve that issue on appeal. You need to have made the right motions at the trial court. Otherwise, you'll lose for procedural reasons. So that's why it's done. It's not going to win. I wouldn't think that we'll get anywhere. Eye rolling and sighing and answers seems inappropriate during cross. I agree. I think that's a little bit lacking in professionalism. But I didn't notice enough of it when I was just watching to really think it would hurt the prosecution that much. Moreover, I think the fact that Brodd just had a bad day. Like, I was not impressed by his answers in terms of how he defended the use of force. So I'll look at if you guys have any other questions, let me know. Other than that, I think that's all I got to say today. I thought today again, not a great day for the defense. A mediocre expert witness who got very cross-examined very effectively by the prosecution. Some decent stuff that came out of some of the factual development that Nelson did, but he will need better expert witnesses. If the defense is going to win this, they need better. They can't have all the expert witnesses be like that, because I think the end result of that is the jury basically disregarding Brodd and going with what the prosecution witnesses said about use of force, even if there was tension between what those prosecution witnesses were saying. So that's what I got. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys very likely tomorrow, and we'll talk more about this. Peace.